So one thing that most people don't know about me is that I have an incredible fascination with Mr. Rogers. So much so to the point where I have a life's goal of bringing Mr. Rogers' energy of inclusiveness into every single class that I teach so that all of my students feel loved, which is why I want to begin my thesis presentation with a practice that Mr. Rogers taught, where you bring to mind the people who have loved you into being. So if you'd like to join, begin now to think of all of those people who have loved you into being, some of whom may still be with you, but others who may have passed on. And then continue to think of these individuals for the next 10 seconds, and I'll mind the time. Thank you for doing that with me. I love him so much, don't you? All right, so my thesis is called Heart of Resilience, a therapeutic approach to supporting caregivers through the Pañcamayakośa Model. And this is dedicated to my grandparents, John and Lois Sexauer. My grandpa was the caregiver for my grandma for many years during her long decline. And he was very kind as a caregiver, more so than he even was when we were kids, I would say. He would read to her and then wait until she fell asleep and then quietly close the book. Just very soft, tender acts of care to grandma. And he told his preacher, once one of us goes, the other one will be gone within 6 months. But he died 2 days after her, even though he was in fairly good health. And so that morning that he died, my dad was over visiting him, and grandpa told my dad, I've had a good life. I have no regrets. And he even smiled, and then just minutes later had his heart attack and died. And so that really got me thinking, why is it that some people feel so frightened of end of life, and why others seem to be able to step through that portal with less fear? And I asked the question in my thesis, who is death? And one thing that I looked at were different archetypes and personifications, imagery of death, thinking, is it part of our culture and the symbols that we have in our culture that contribute to this feeling of fear of death or bravery at the end of life? And some of the archetypes and personifications that I looked at were in Greek mythology. I observed Hades and Thanatos, both very adversarial, frightening personifications of death, would kidnap, steal, lie, were very cunning. And then I also looked at Christianity and the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The 4th horseman is the horseman of death. He rides on a pale horse and is described almost looking like a monster. And interestingly enough, the horseman of death is accompanied by Hades, which really surprised me to hear that Hades from Greek mythology was listed in the Bible. But I feel that that adds to the horror of the scene of the end days. And then I looked into Vedic origins at Yama, the Lord of the Dead, who's pictured here. And Yama is very different from these frightening, terrifying images of death. Yama is more of a teacher who on multiple occasions interacted with humans and was able to give advice, teachings of yoga, and even blessings or boons. And one of those instances was in the Katha Upanishad, where he met with a young boy named Nachiketas. And Nachiketas goes to Yama, goes to death, and asks many questions, one of which is there something that continues on after we die, or when we die, is that all there is? And first, Yama is a little bit apprehensive to share this knowledge. He says, oh, this is even confusing for the gods. You wouldn't understand. I don't even know how to say it. But Nachiketas was persistent. And finally, Yama told him that there is this self that lies here, hidden in the heart of a living being. And then he guided Nachiketas that to live virtuously while continuing to turn inward toward that power of the true self. And that understanding of there being this sort of inner witness, this consciousness within, really was a through line through my entire thesis, that I decided to take the concept of Sankhya philosophy, because there is this idea of Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha is more of what we think of as that inner self, that inner witness. But as we know with caregivers, which is the topic of my thesis, caregivers are also dealing with a lot of real world struggle and difficulty, which falls into this other category of prakriti. So Purusha is the witness, prakriti is the ever-changing material world. So to break that down even more simply, you could think of Purusha as being your inner witness, and prakriti is everything else in this world. It is the tree that grows, it's our physical bodies, our minds, our thoughts, all of that. So we have these two pieces of ourselves. Now, to address all of the things that caregivers experience, I wanted to look a little bit more in this category of prakriti. What are we experiencing in this physical world? And to do that, I used the Pañcamayakośa model. The Pañcamayakośa model is a layered system that describes human existence. And the best way that I could think of using or describing a layered system is with the matryoshka or nesting dolls. So Pañcamayakośa is a Sanskrit word that is consisting of three smaller words. Pancha, meaning five. Maya is consisting of or made up of. And kosha is a sheath. So each of these dolls will represent a kosha or a sheath. The largest one is the first sheath, the physical body. Annamayakosha, the layer that is made up of food. It's the first thing you see when somebody walks in the room. They walk in the room, you see their physical body, it's their anatomy. But then within that layer is a smaller doll that will represent the pranamayakosha, the energetic layer, which if you were to think of would be more of like our physiological functioning. And for a yoga therapist, they would look at the breath and understanding how one is breathing and how that type of breathing might be affecting all the other areas of their life. The next doll, the next layer, is the Manomayakosha, the layer made up of the mind. This is where we have our cognition, our understanding of 2 + 2 = 4. This also is where we might start to have our self-talk. Within that doll, they keep coming, folks. Oh, wait, there's more. This is the Vijnanamayakosha, the layer that is made up of knowledge. This is where our wisdom, our idea of a bigger life for ourselves and for our communities, an idea of something that's right or wrong, a strong moral sense, that is here within this wisdom layer. And then the smaller layer, and as they get smaller, they become more and more subtle, harder to see, harder to perceive, is the Anandamayakosha, the layer that's made up of bliss. This is the most subtle layer, and it's what you might think of as how you're connected to your spirituality or your sense of something else, something beyond. And if we were talking back to the idea of the self, then that inner witness, that self, might be somewhere inside of this layer, separate from the other layers. The layers are independent yet connected simultaneously, but the self resides within all of them. And so considering that model, which is really the heart of my thesis, I started to think of how can I then utilize this idea of the self, this idea of our witness and our material world to support caregivers. So I want to share a bit about caregivers specifically. That in the context of this thesis, caregivers are defined as any person who provides care for someone who's experiencing illness, injury, or disability. And some really staggering facts about caregivers are that about 53 million Americans are considered caregivers, who often spend between 40 and 60 hours every week providing unpaid care, which means that it can be really difficult to hold other employment during the time that they're offering care. And oftentimes, even when a caregiver becomes ill, they fail to seek help for themselves because they're so invested in their loved one. And this can affect stress levels, anxiety, depression. It can affect the immune system, short-term memory, and even increased inflammation, which can affect both the heart and the lungs. And that different populations experience this differently. For example, female caregivers often have higher blood pressure than male caregivers. And then also for people who experience asthma or COPD, those symptoms can be increased for them during the time of giving care. And all of these things that caregivers experience are really symptoms of something else. These are manifestations of a deeper root cause, which is why when a yoga therapist works with a caregiver, it's important to look at what might be causing the experiences that they're having. Caregiver burden, which I list up here, is a term that's used a lot in studies on this topic. And it really describes the culmination of all of these symptoms. This is the physical, the emotional, financial stress, all bundled into one. And so it's looking to uncover what is behind that caregiver burden, which is why a yoga therapist will seek to reduce symptoms, first of all, so that the person is not suffering, and empower the individual to reduce their own symptoms while consistently turning back and looking to what is causing this in the first place, which might be something like those personifications of death, how someone is experiencing or looking at death. And it might be something more mechanical, how someone is moving repeatedly, causing something to occur. So all of this was basically the first half of my thesis. And the second half was more of a practical application. If you are a caregiver, what might you be experiencing, and what yoga therapy interventions have been shown effective for supporting those? So I want to go briefly through each of these lovely layers. We have the Pañcamayakośa, that physical layer. A lot of times what can be affected is musculoskeletal conditions like back pain, joint stiffness, or repetitive strain injuries, especially if someone has to lift another individual and move a lot. And the intervention that I found was the Pavan series of joint exercises, which really help to gently move your joints around, distributing the synovial fluid within your joint to keep things moving and free of pain as much as possible. The next layer is the Pañcamayakośa. Caregivers may experience shallow or erratic breathing patterns due to the stress, which alternate nostril breathing, or nadi shodhana, has been shown effective to support. An interesting fact about that alternate nostril breathing, it can in some cases increase the neurotransmitter GABA, which potentially supports the vagus nerve and lowering allostatic load. And that's the load of stress that we're consistently carrying with us. The next layer is the layer of the mind. Here's where we find that a caregiver might experience depression, feelings of hopelessness, or loss of identity. And the practice for this that I found really effective was Therapeutic, which often is referred to as candle gazing, but it really is staring at any fixed point consistently in deep concentration. And one contraindication for Therapeutic is if you have seizures with photosensitivity. You might want to not stare at a candle or flickering light, but just stare at a mark on the wall. In the layer of wisdom, sometimes this is where a caregiver might have difficult finding meaning or feel that they're lacking trust or intuition in making these difficult decisions. And this is where I found a hand gesture, a hasta mudra, called the Hridaya Mudra, and that is the heart gesture. So this is one way of containing one's energy in order to elevate their ability to think and to see that larger picture. And it's a hand position that's done. It's not very difficult to do for many people, but if you find that your hands don't make the shape, these can be done mentally. And then one interesting thing about the mudras that I learned from Dr. Ananda Bhavanani in our trip to India is he said that if you were to go outside on a cold day, and not wear a hat, you would get cold because your heat would float away. So when you do something like a hasta mudra, that holds in the energy, so you're containing it. You're allowing yourself to experience more. In the bliss layer, this is where someone might feel a loss of connection or a loss of faith. And chanting the seed sound Om, as we have already done, has been shown to really cultivate a greater sense of connection, a greater sense of unity, and even hope. In integrating all of these layers of being, you can use practices like art therapy, which has body mapping. Body mapping is an art therapy technique where one would draw the shape or outline of their own body, and then through their own artistic expression, it doesn't have to be hyper realistic, draw what they're experiencing or feeling. If there's an area of their body that has pain, maybe they draw that and notice what colors and shapes they're using for that. And our fellow yoga therapist, Kathy Dario, used this in some of her clients to understand what someone is experiencing in the various bodies of their koshas. And so someone, I drew these for example, would draw what they feel in their body, what they feel in their energy, what they feel in their mind, what they feel in their bliss. And then you can have a reflective practice of looking back at what you drew and maybe have a clearer understanding of what you're actually experiencing because you've taken it outside of yourself. So the heart of the matter, or in other words, conclusion, is that cultivating balance requires a harmony between Purusha, that witness, and Prakriti, the manifest state. That we're living in this world, we have both as part of our experience. And the koshas, these beautiful nesting dolls here, they're part of Prakriti, they're part of the world that we live in. And when they're supported, they can serve as a pathway that leads you back to your own Purusha, your own inner consciousness. And that symptom reduction is important. It gets you immediately out of the state of suffering and then leads you to be able to seek that deeper level, which is why we need reflective practices that lead towards self-inquiry, and that yoga supports both clinical wellness models and spiritual integration, which can support caregivers at every layer of their being. I wish my grandpa had a little of that in his life, but he was doing great. He actually shared a mini autobiography of himself with his preacher so that she'd have some really good things to say about him when the funeral time came. And we didn't know he did this, but he shared all of his childhood stories and also a quote. Now, the quote that he shared was from a book called A Winter Dream. And in that book, the gentleman was writing to his one son. But when Grandpa repasted this into his little autobiography, he said, "This is to my sons and to my grandchildren." And I'd like to share it with you because I feel it kind of wraps up this really amazing life that he lived. It says, "Always, always remember that adversity is not a detour. It is part of the path. You will encounter obstacles. You will make mistakes. Be grateful for both. Your obstacles and mistakes will be your greatest teachers. And the only way to not make mistakes in life is to do nothing, which is the biggest mistake of all. Your challenges, if you let them, will become your greatest allies. Mountains will crush you or raise you, depending on the side of the mountain you choose to stand on." And those words of wisdom and everything else my grandpa taught me has led me to the fact that every time I do that Mr. Rogers practice of thinking of the people who have loved me into being, I will be thinking of my grandparents, John and Lois. Thanks.